Welcome to In the Word, end of another week into a new book of the Bible, a significant book in my opinion. It's going to have significance not only in and of itself, but later Jesus, during his Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and 25, refers to the book of Daniel. And Daniel is a key book laying out the prophetic timeline that Jesus himself gives us more details about in the book of Revelation. So, very important book. One of the key themes in Daniel is the sovereignty of God. We already discussed chapter 1, where we see Daniel's personal history. And we could label that the sovereignty of God over Daniel's life, the personal sovereignty of God. The section we're in now begins in chapter 2 and goes to chapter 7. Recounts various incidents and stories that are arranged thematically around the sovereignty of God during the times of the Gentiles. The time of the the sovereignty of God over the nations during the time of the Gentiles. That time of the Gentiles is the period of time where there is no ruler on David's throne. Began in 586 BC with the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of the nation, and will continue until Revelation 19, and Jesus returns, and in Revelation 20 establishes his throne, his kingdom. So chapters 2 through 7, the sovereignty of God over the nations during the time of the Gentiles, and we saw in chapter 2 this great image. Today we have the familiar story of the fiery furnace and the vision of the high tree. Again, note God's sovereignty and how how Nebuchadnezzar comes to recognize the sovereignty of God. Other stories we'll see in chapter 5 is Belshazzar's feast. And again, that's the famous incident with the writing on the wall, the hand appears, and that is also the time that the Persians overthrew Babylon that very evening. Daniel in the lion's den in chapter 6, and then Daniel's vision of the four beasts and the Ancient of Days in chapter 7. That will round out this section about God's sovereignty over the nations during the time of the Gentiles. Later, when we get to chapter 8, I think that'll be your reading on Sunday. You'll move into God's sovereignty over Israel during the times of the Gentiles. Again, really important sections there, really important verses. Let's dive into chapter 3 here. If you've been in church at all, or if you've been raised in the church especially, you know about the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And again, I think one of the things we can learn from this is whenever someone seeks to be faithful to the Lord, they're going to be challenged. And in this case, they were challenged their faith was challenged in a significant way. So verses 1 through 7 will describe that challenge. The challenge was Nebuchadnezzar erecting an image 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. That's 60 cubits by 6 cubits. Massive image that he is expecting to have to be worshipped. Put yourself in the exile's shoes right now. If you were an exiled Jew, having been taken out of Israel in 605, for example, that you are there, and you know you're there because of idolatry. And here you're being challenged by the local ruler to serve an idol. Don't know exactly when this happened. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, adds that this happened at about 586. So it kind of concurrent with the final fall of Jerusalem. Also point out that I'm not an archaeology expert, but archaeological discoveries sometimes come across my desk and confirm things that have happened in the Bible. One archaeological discovery was the finding of a very large square in the ground in an area about 6 miles south of the city of Babylon. Archaeologists believe that this could possibly be the base for this image. It was in a big enclosed area so people could come into it. That word Dura, that's just a generic phrase for a enclosed area. So the plain of Dura would be an enclosed plain, and that seems to be what they found. Starting in verse 8 then, we see the challenge to faith. Starting in verse 8, we see the test of faith. And goes through verse 12. Notice a couple things here. The Chaldeans are coming forward. They have been perennial enemies of the Jews. And they come forward with this accusation against certain Jews in verse 12. And there's another phrase in here. I guess I can't find it while you're looking at me. But certain Jews. So apparently not all Jews decided to be faithful. Just certain Jews did. And the Jews they have in mind are these men that Daniel has brought into the government, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the local officials are angry with them, and they're trying to make the king angry with them, and they're going to succeed. Notice the anti-Semitism in this. They're singling out the Jews. Jews are often accused of disloyalty due to their religion. That's happened over generations, and it's just not the case, but it's often twisted out of shape and used and brought in an accusation against them. So we see that they're successful in verse 13. Nebuchadnezzar is in a furious rage. If you trace that through the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar seems to have a temper. It shows up several times. So he brings the accusation against them in verse 14. And the end of verse 15 he says, "Who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" So this is a sarcastic remark and kind of betrays Nebuchadnezzar's attitude that there is no higher political or religious authority in heaven or on earth that's going to change his judgment. Who is going to deliver you? Who could possibly do that? Who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? So we see him exercising his religious power, his political power, his power to judge. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are not fazed by this at all. They are standing firm. In fact, they're standing firm not in the idea that they're necessarily going to be delivered, but rather that their God is sovereign. And whether he delivers them now or vindicates them later, he exists and he will be sovereign and he cannot be trifled with. And that's what they end up here with, and they face their hope on him. Notice also that he's bringing this against certain Jews, not all Jews, but it's apparent that some Jews have acquiesced, and of course they're going to be judged. We've seen this over and over in the historical books, that God will bring judgment on his disobedient people. So, we learn that, compromise doesn't lead to safety. The safest place you can be is in an obedient place with God. He'll protect you or he'll vindicate you. That's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are affirming here. Either he's going to deliver them out of the fiery furnace or he won't. He'll choose not to. He's sovereign. That's up to him. But ultimately, God will show himself, show them to have been right, that there will become a day of judgment where Nebuchadnezzar is going to have to face the fact that he was wrong. So that comes pretty quickly. Verses 19 through 25, we see Nebuchadnezzar is so angry that he throws them into the furnace, bound in their clothes and in their hat and everything else. In other words, usually when someone was led to a place of execution, they're led there naked. They're stripped naked when they're executed, added final humiliation. Not in this case. The king was so enraged that he ordered the furnace to be heated up 7 times its normal heat. and these guys to be tossed in, and when they opened the furnace, the heat was so intense, it even killed their executioners. So that's how bad it was. You can imagine these furnaces as kind of shaped like a milk bottle, old-fashioned milk bottle, underground, with the top of the milk bottle kind of in a hillside or something. That's where if you were going to smelt metal, the metal would be put in there. It's a small door in the side where combustible material, wood or coal, could be inserted into the side of the furnace. And then small holes where bellows, and we know these from archaeology, small holes where bellows could be inserted, very large bellows, to heat up the furnace. So some estimate that a furnace like this could be heated up to 1600 degrees Fahrenheit or 875 degrees Celsius. So quite hot. And they're thrown in there, and Nebuchadnezzar peers in, and what does he see? He sees four people. He sees four people walking around, unbound, not on fire, not wreathing in agony, and one of them appears to be like one of the gods, a son of a god, which would be equivalent to a god. So Nebuchadnezzar here is a polytheist. He is not becoming a monotheist. He sees a god-like figure in the furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he simply adds him to the pantheon of gods he already worships. So to that extent, he continues to be essentially an unbeliever. He's not believing correctly about God. He recognizes his sovereignty and recognizes his power. And then verses 26 and following, we see this recognition of faith by Nebuchadnezzar. This is the whole point, that God is going to demand worship. God's going to demand recognition. Chapter 4 then is this vision of a high tree, maybe less familiar to you here. But first we see the proclamation of Nebuchadnezzar in the first 3 verses. This is actually kind of a cut and paste by Daniel of a letter that Nebuchadnezzar wrote. So here we have a unbeliever, a pagan, Nebuchadnezzar himself, who destroys Jerusalem, actually writing a few verses in the Bible. Verses 4 through 9 then, we see the wise men are frustrated. They can't understand or they can't interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream of this high tree, and he calls for Daniel, as he's done in the past. And this time Nebuchadnezzar tells of the dream, and Daniel hears it, and starting in verse 19 through 26, 19 through 27, Daniel interprets the dream. Notice that Daniel's alarmed by the dream. Daniel, whose name is Belshazzar, was dismayed for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. So he's afraid to tell the king this dream. He's kind of freaked out by it. But he tells him nevertheless. And everything that was in the dream, the king temporarily becoming insane, being in the field like an ox, acting like an animal. This actually came to pass in verse 28. A couple theories. I know I'm going over a little bit, sorry. A couple theories on when that might have happened. Some think, again, that this is in conjunction with the events around 586, so it'll be about that time. Others think it happened in about 570 BC. They look at other events around that time, and they come to the conclusion that it was about 570 BC. I think a better answer, a better understanding, is that it happened between 582 and 575. It was during this period of time, and this was basically the only period of time in Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and we have historical records of that, where he did not have a whole series of military campaigns. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar was not active during this time internationally. So seems to be this is the time that Nebuchadnezzar had lost his mind. Verse 34 begins the restoration of Nebuchadnezzar. And again, he recognizes God's sovereignty, his dominion. He closes this as he began in verse 3. God's dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. So there, another instance of God's sovereignty over the Gentile nations during the time of the Gentiles being exerted by even raising up and tearing down and raising up again Nebuchadnezzar. And during that whole time, I think maybe the real miracle was, during that whole time, his kingdom is preserved. So enjoy your reading. This weekend I will have a introduction to Daniel, kind of an overview of the book to help you through your weekend reading. So look for that on Saturday morning. God bless you, brothers and sisters. Enjoy the book of Daniel. I know I do.